The church is called to be separate from the world, to be salt and light. But what happens when, instead of being separate from the world, the church compromises with the world and actually becomes a part of the world? We're going to talk about that on this week's episode of Revelation Unveiled on Faith by Reason. Welcome to Faith by Reason. The website behind it all is faithbyreason.net. There you will find hundreds of hours of study material, blogs, videos, and podcasts. And we are continuing our study of the book of Revelation. In Revelation chapter 2, the 7 letters to 7 churches, or the epistles of Jesus. Yes, these are 7 epistles written by Jesus himself, well, rather dictated to the Apostle John by Jesus, so it's obviously some important information here. So we are taking time to slowly go through these short epistles because they are just densely packed with information that is going to just greatly impact us. In fact, I would say that these 2 chapters, Revelation chapter 2 and 3, are the most important to the contemporary church. And we've talked about why in the past. So let's just start by diving in to the passage on the next church, the church at Pergamos. Pergamos is the third church. We've already gone through and studied the first 2, the church at Ephesus and the church at Smyrna. So now here we go with the church at Pergamum or Pergamos, and depending on which Bible you use, I'm going to use Pergamos. Reading from the New King James. Verse 12, and to the angel of the church in Pergamos writes, these things says he who has a sharp 2-edged sword. I know your works, and where you dwell, where Satan's throne is, and you hold fast to my name, and did not deny my faith, even in the days in which Antipas was my faithful martyr, who was killed among you, where Satan dwells. But I have a few things against you, because you have those there who hold the doctrine of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the children of Israel, to eat things sacrificed to idols, and to commit sexual immorality. Thus you also have those who hold the doctrine of the Nicolaitans, which thing I hate. Repent, or else I will come to you quickly, and fight against them with the sword of my mouth. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To him who overcomes, I will give some of the hidden manna to eat. I will give him a white stone, and on the stone a new name written, which no one knows except him who receives it. Okay, so I think as we can see just by looking at these verses superficially, is that Pergamos got a bit of a mixed report card. There's some good, but some very, very bad stuff happening. And we're going to get into it. But before we break these verses down, as usual, we're going to start with the historic point of view and look at the actual city of Pergamos and the church in Pergamos. Because again, these 7 churches are 7 actual churches and actual cities in ancient Asia Minor, which is modern day Turkey. Pergamos was a very prominent city during the 1st century, during the time this letter was written. But unlike Ephesus and Sardis, which were prominent because of their riches, mainly due to the fact that they were port cities and they were the center of trade, international trade at the time, and the merchants made the city rich. No, Pergamos was rich not because of trade, but because of politics and religion. Pergamos was considered the eastern capital of the Roman Empire to a great degree. And because of that, there were a lot of influential people going in and out of the city all the time. The prominent senators from Rome would visit there, so it became prominent in that sense. It was kind of like Washington, D.C. here in America, and it's in the corridors of power, so very powerful people would travel through the area. And also, politics and religion during that time were always intertwined, so it became a very important religious center. Now, Pergamos' prominence started actually a couple of empires earlier with the Persian Empire. When they were marching west to conquer Greece, they made Pergamos one of their capital cities. And when that happened, it gained that kind of power and influence, and as an area of where the corridors of power were. Now, when the Greek Empire defeated the Persians, well, when you defeat your enemy, what you want to do is take over their prominent areas and kind of show your dominance. So when Alexander the Great and the Greeks conquered the Persian Empire, they said, well, your old capital is now going to be our capital. So Pergamos then became a capital, one of the capitals of the Greek Empire, and of course, again, in the corridors of power. And subsequently, when the Roman Empire defeated the Greek Empire, they did the same thing. Your capital is going to be our capital because we're going to show our dominance over you. And we get to where we are in this letter, where it is one of the eastern capitals of the Roman Empire. So tons of power and influence were in that city. And of course, the Christian church that was established in Pergamos had to deal with the issues of being in a very, very powerful secular area. And since the Roman Empire was not very favorable towards Christians, how did they survive? Well, Ephesus, as we know from a couple broadcasts ago, Ephesus dealt with their church and their issues by just being really strong on the word. They were very strong on doctrine. They didn't compromise their doctrine. Sardis, on the other hand, they were persecuted. They just had to endure the persecution. They were strong. They were persecuted, and they had to deal with it. The church at Pergamos, on the other hand, they had a different way of dealing with the world around them in that secular world. And their way of doing it was to be non-threatening. The Ephesians were pretty threatening because they were so hardcore on their doctrine. The Smyrna was threatening in their own way because no matter what you did, no matter how hard you persecuted the church at Smyrna, they just prevailed. They just held on. They just kept worshiping God. The church at Pergamum, they decided that they were going to be inclusive and inviting and, again, non-threatening. They compromised. And we're going to talk about that quite a bit more. One other special thing to note is what the name means. Each one of these churches, the name that they have is another layer of complexity that Jesus had when he chose these particular 7 churches to write these letters to. The word Pergamos means, well, there's 2 words that come together. There's the latter part of the word, which is gamos, which refers to a coupling or a marriage. We see remnants of gamos in some of our current words like polygamy and monogamy. We see that gamo in there, and that again refers to intimate relations between people. And the first part actually means undesirable or unholy. So when you put the para, which means, again, undesirable, unholy, with gamos, which is a union or a marriage, you get unholy marriage or mixed marriage. And that's what Pergamum means. It means a union between an unholy or undesirable union. And that's going to, again, it's basically a pun for the church at Pergamos. Okay, so with the history out of the way, let's just break down the verse. The verse is Revelation chapter 2, starting verse 12. To the angel or the messenger of the church in Pergamos write, these things says he who has a sharp two-edged sword. Now, as we know, we've talked about before, in every one of these letters, Jesus gives a different title of himself. And that title is very germane to what's going on with the church, its problems and the praise. And in this case, Jesus calls himself he who has a sharp two-edged sword. So those of you who have been studying the Bible for any length of time, you know what the idiom of a sharp two-edged sword is. It's actually the Bible. In fact, in the book of Hebrews, chapter 4, verse 12, it says, for the word of God is living and powerful and sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing even into the division of soul and spirit, and of the joints and marrow, and is the discerner of the thoughts and talents of the heart. So again, when Jesus is calling himself here the Word of God, it's particularly the two-edged sword that separates, that divides, and divides what's good from what's bad. So apparently whatever's going on here in Pergamos, they need to be aware of the Bible in that it divides what's holy from unholy. All right, so let's keep going to the next verse. I know your works. And this is common. Jesus says this in every single one of the letters. Jesus knows our works, and which is good news or bad news, depending on what your works are. I know your works and where you dwell, where Satan's throne is. Okay, let's stop and look at this. This is very interesting. Where Satan's throne is. There are a lot of misnomers about Satan, especially in the secular world, but even again with some Christians who aren't very well learned. A lot of these people will believe that Satan is more powerful than he actually is. He is not. Compared to God, he is not powerful at all, even though the common depiction of him of Satan in popular culture is someone who is God's equal and his enemy, and that there's some kind of war going on between the forces of God and the forces of Satan, and they're pretty evenly matched, and they just go back and forth in this war. That's not even remotely the case. Satan is nowhere near as powerful as God. He is infinitesimally less powerful than God. God created Satan. He could wipe him out in a second. We will see later in the book of Revelation when Satan is finally defeated, God just has a random angel toss him into the bottomless pit without any effort. God to Satan is a bigger chasm between you and an ant. That is how different and the power levels are. So Satan is not powerful, and Satan is not omnipresent. God is omnipresent. God can be everywhere at once. God can be speaking to me and you across the world, across the country. No, any time of day or night, he can be speaking with millions of people at the same time. He's omnipresent. Satan is not omnipresent. Satan has locality. Now, granted, because Satan is a spirit, he is not as defined to a physical area as we are, but still he has locality. So when it says here, this is where Satan's throne is, I don't believe that was a metaphor. I believe Jesus is speaking. This is where Satan's physical throne is. What does that mean? Why does Satan need a physical area? Well, because we've studied in the past, in the supernatural worldview, which, by the way, I highly, highly recommend you read and listen to the blogs and podcasts about the supernatural realm. You will not understand the Bible. You will never, ever fully understand the Bible unless you understand and embrace the supernatural worldview. And it's not very popular because, again, it gets very spiritual and all kind of spooky with some of the stuff that goes on in the world that we can't see. But again, it is vital to understanding what's truly going on in the entire biblical narrative. What we learned in the supernatural worldview is that there are areas on the earth where you could say that heaven and earth meet, or the spiritual realm and the physical realm meet. And these are areas where the spiritual beings can transverse and come into the material world. They can't just materialize anywhere they want. They have to either be summoned to this world by human beings, and that's a whole another subject for another day, or they can go from the spiritual realm to the physical realm through at a physical location. One of them prominently in the Bible is Jacob's ladder in Genesis, where Jacob sees angels, good angels, going up and down these stairs from heaven to earth. These are angels that have been sent by God to do earthly missions. And this point where Jacob saw this ladder is one of the physical points where the spiritual realm and the physical realm meet, a gateway, as it were, between the realms. There are others. There's, for example, Mount Hermon, or Mount Bashan, as it's also called, is, according to the apocryphal book of Enoch, this is where the angels who sinned, and we see them in Genesis chapter 6, and again, go to the supernatural worldview to get more details on that. This is where those angels came in and committed the sin that caused them to be locked up. You read about that in the book of Jude and in the book of 2 Peter, where the angels who left their estate and came down to earth and sinned. It happened on Mount Hermon. And there are other places around the world where, again, the spiritual and the physical meet, and a gateway is there. And it's obvious that Pergamos was one of those places. It was Satan's physical throne at the time, and we'll talk about why in a few minutes. But briefly, as I stated, Pergamos was a corridor of political power and religious power. So if Satan is going to be physically located someplace, he's going to be located in a place where he has the maximum amount of influence. Satan is still the God, little g, of this world. He still has that influence. He influences all governments, all political areas. And at the time, the Roman Empire was the most prominent empire, so it would make sense that Satan, if he had a physical throne, it would be in a place where those corridors of power were. All right, let's keep reading. Where Satan's throne is, and you hold fast to my name and did not deny my faith, even in the days in which Antipas, my faithful martyr, was killed among you, where Satan dwells. So this is the good part of the report card. Jesus commends this church for holding fast to his name, even though they are in this area of massive corruption and massive secular influence. They held fast to his name and they didn't deny him. So that's the good news. So let's get to the bad part of the report card. Verse 4. But I have a few things against you, because you have those who hold the doctrine of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the children of Israel to eat things sacrificed to idols and to commit sexual immorality. All right, what does this mean? Who is Balaam and who is Balak? Well, unless you are a student of the Old Testament, you probably aren't too familiar with Balaam and Balak. Now, you may have heard about Balaam just because of a pretty funny incident that happened with him. We see in the book of Numbers, chapter 22, where Balaam was going to do something that God didn't like. He was going to a city that God told him not to go to, and he was riding a donkey into the city, and there was an angel on the gate of the city that was there to kill Balaam because he was being disobedient. Balaam couldn't see the angel, his donkey could, so the donkey stopped. Balaam didn't know what was happening. He thought that the donkey was being stubborn, so he cursed the donkey and he beat the donkey. And then God gave the donkey the ability to talk, and the donkey said, hey, I'm paraphrasing obviously, hey, why are you beating on me? There's an angel there who's going to kill you. I'm just trying to stop you from dying. So don't tell me God doesn't have a sense of humor. But the full story of Balaam was a prophet given the gift of prophecy by God. So he would hear what God would say and he would speak it. He was very good at it, very good to the point where he decided to sell his services. He became a prophet for hire, or a prophet for profit. Okay, bad joke, but anyway, moving on. So Balaam was around during the time of the wilderness wandering, when the children of Israel, they had come out of Egypt and they were headed towards the promised land. And during the time of the wilderness wandering, they become a mighty army. They had a lot of young men who were great fighters, and they went to the promised land, conquering and defeating lots of enemies on the way. And they were headed towards the area of Moab, which is an ancient kingdom on the way to the promised land. And Balak was the leader of Moab, and he saw this Israeli army coming, and he was afraid. He didn't want them to conquer him. So he goes and hires Balaam to prophesy against Israel. So Balaam went to try to do it, but unfortunately, God didn't want Israel to be cursed for obvious reasons. So every time Balaam tried to curse Israel, he ended up blessing them. So he tried to curse Israel 3 times, and he ended up blessing Israel 3 times. So understandably, Balak was upset about this. He says, look, man, I paid you money to curse these people, and you keep blessing them. And Balak said, hey, I can only tell you what God tells me. So, there's nothing I can do about that. God wants them blessed, they're going to be blessed. But here's something we can do. So Balaam gave Balak this idea. He said, look, the young men fighting for Israel, they're all virgins. According to their law, they are not allowed to have intercourse outside of the marriage covenant. So these guys are all unmarried. That's why they're the top fighters, because they're unmarried. They don't have a family at home to deal with. So they've never been with a woman. So here's what you do. When they get close to the city, you go take some of your prettiest girls, your prettiest young ladies, and you put them in the gate of the city and have them be seductive. Well, and when the guys get there to conquer the city, they're going to be entranced by these women. They're going to take them and make wives of them. They're going to basically have sex with them. And that'll mingle your 2 people together, and it will keep them from conquering you, and it'll completely corrupt them. So Balak thought it was a good idea. He did it. He got his prettiest girls to get into the gates of the city, and sure enough, the Israelite men found them attractive, and they took them and made wives of them, and it worked. These women were that stumbling block before the children of Israel that completely derailed the invasion, and there was sexual immorality there. So that's what we see here in verse 14. So essentially, the sin of Balaam, or the doctrine of Balaam, is number 1, compromising for money and influence. That's why Balaam was using his God-given gifts to gain money and power and influence, and also compromising with the world and leading other children of God into the same compromise and corruption, leading to idolatry, sin, and even worse. Okay, so that is a report card on Pergamos, the good and the bad. So at this point in the study is when we look at the other 3 levels. We finished the historic level, and we have to do the level as it affects the ecclesiastical church, the personal level, and the prophetic level. And I usually do that in that order, but I wanted to change the order around and do the prophetic level next, because it encompasses the church ecclesiastical level as well as the personal level, as you'll see. I don't think it takes a whole lot of imagination to understand and to see areas where the church at large has compromised with the world to be accepted, to be tolerated, to get praise and money, and just be accepted by the world, and take on the entrapments of the world. And personally, the same thing. We often personally compromise ourselves and our belief in God in order to be accepted, in order not to be shunned, in order to keep or maintain our power. And we'll talk about that as it relates to the prophetic area, and because I think that the prophetic level is really, really interesting. It's going to take some time. This will be a longer episode, but it's really worth it to see how the church got to the point of where it was in Pergamos, and how it affects us to this very day. So on a prophetic level, I've said before, we've talked about this for the past few episodes, that these 7 churches, in the order in which the letters were written, are seen to represent the entire history of the church. It tells the history of the church beforehand. Each one of these churches represent a different era of time in the last 2,000 years of church history. The Ephesian church represents the apostolic church of the 1st and 2nd century. They were really strong on doctrine because they lived through the time of most of the disciples, but they were weak on love. Smyrna, as we talked about last week, is the persecuted church, the church that suffered greatly under Rome. Yet despite that persecution, the church grew. As the saying goes, the growth of the church, the growth of the seed of the church was watered by the blood of the martyrs. So at the end of this period of time, of the Smyrna period of time, the church had been driven underground. They were being furiously persecuted. They were imprisoned, beaten, killed, and basically driven underground. So then the next church, Pergamos, would represent that next stage of the church age, which would be the medieval church. And how did this change happen? What changed for Christians, and what made this church different? Well, it all begins with a very colorful man, a Roman emperor known as Constantine the Great, who ruled for the early part of the 4th century, the 300s. During the time of Constantine's reign, the Roman Empire was suffering its own issues. It had a deep debt, it had high taxes, had a virtually worthless currency because the money had been so devalued. It had a pretty apathetic population that was more concerned with their entertainment and their excesses and their largesse than reality. And they had a huge government bureaucracy. They were suffering external threats from barbaric zealots in other countries who despised the Romans for their lavish lifestyle. Internally, they were split apart politically by 2 political groups who pretty much hated and despised each other, and that hate and despise was growing greatly to the point where there was a burgeoning civil war. And they were essentially being invaded by neighboring immigrants who wanted the benefits of Rome without the responsibility of actually being a Roman citizen. Again, and all the while, the citizens of Rome were, again, too intoxicated by their largesse, their entertainment, and their sports, and their perceived invincibility to even care about it. That sounds eerily familiar, doesn't it? Does it remind you of another country that's suffering going through this exact same predicament? Interesting. But let's move on. So Constantine had to deal with a civil war. Basically, the eastern part of the empire was splitting up, and they were fighting against the western part, which Constantine ruled over. So in 312 AD, there was a climactic battle called the Battle of Milvian Bridge, where Constantine would stage his final campaign against a rival emperor in the east. So the night before that climactic battle, Constantine claimed he saw the cross, the Christian cross, a vision of that cross, and he heard the words, "In this sign conquer." Well, Constantine went out the next day, he and his army, and they won the battle. They were able to unite the empire in the civil war, and Constantine was able to consolidate his power. And so because he saw this cross, Constantine figured that the Christian God was on his side, and Constantine converted to Christianity. This was incredible. This is one of the most monumental events in history, Christian and secular history, the conversion of Constantine. As a Christian, of course, Constantine, he legalized Christianity. Christianity was now legal. Instead of being the pariahs of society, Christians were now able to come out of the catacombs, come out of hiding, and be accepted in the Roman Empire. Not just accepted, they got prominent positions. Again, as a Christian, Constantine favored Christians at court. Christians were his advisors now. Constantine enacted several unprecedented reforms. He Christianized Rome to a great degree. He formed the Council of Nicaea, a very famous council that voted on consolidating the Bible because he wanted to have the Bibles available to people. And so this council brought together all the books of the Old and New Testament. They came up with the creeds about Jesus and salvation and the disciples and blood atonement and the virgin birth and all these things. They made those into one coherent doctrine. Constantine forbade work on Sundays, which was a big deal for the many slaves in the empire. It gave them a day off. And he had many significant church edifices built, including the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which exists to this day on the purported site of Jesus' tomb. Additionally, and significantly, Constantine named himself the head of the church as its chief pontiff or chief priest, or Pontifex Maximus. That was his title. Emperors aren't really known for being humble, but Constantine made himself Pontifex Maximus. And some of you may know about another group of world leaders who have ruled the world or various parts of it for many, many centuries, who also claim the title of Pontifex Maximus. In fact, there's someone to this day who claims that title, and you can figure out who he is. If you don't know who he is now, you will know by the end of this episode. So the reign of Constantine definitely brought a great deal of relief to the early church and drastically improved their lives. But there are some valid reasons to question the veracity of Constantine's conversion. You see, one thing Constantine did, it is often a myth that there's a myth that Constantine made Christianity the official religion of Rome. He actually didn't do that. That would be one of his fourth successor, Theodosius, would do that, but we'll get to him in a minute. You see, Constantine didn't just legalize Christianity. He legalized all religions of the various cultures in Rome. And also, that title, Pontifex Maximus, he didn't invent that title. He claimed it, but he didn't invent it. It was actually claimed by some previous Roman emperors. So they were not only the head of the pagan priesthoods of Rome previously, but they were also considered God, and a God above all other gods. You see, during the Roman Empire, they didn't mind if you served other gods, because they as they were conquering and absorbing other cultures, they realized that they couldn't just become a theocracy with a single God. They allowed all the people who they conquered to worship their other gods, but you had to worship Caesar as God as well. You had to worship the emperor as God above all the other gods. And if you did that, you were fine. And all the pagans were willing to do that. Christians were not, which is one of the reasons why Christians were so persecuted. Many historians, Christians and secular, including myself, believe that Constantine wasn't really a Christian, but that he was instead a very, very savvy politician who saw the disunity of his empire and the civil wars and the disruption that was happening. And he thought that religion would be a really great way to ease the tensions and bring unity to a fractured empire. Why? Because there are two ways to get people to behave. You can either use force or you can use something intangible. Force, military force, using a police force to create a police state is effective. I mean, people are afraid of the military, so if you use them to keep order, well, yeah, it's effective, but it's not terribly effective, because people will only be obedient as long as they can see or feel the military pressure. For example, one of my problems I have is I tend to drive very fast. I'm a speeder, and the reason I can get away with speeding most of the time is because there aren't enough police to police every single person individually. I know that for every one police officer, there's our highway patrolman, there are thousands of people who he has to try to keep in line. So I know when I speed, there's a pretty good chance that I'm not going to get caught, so I keep speeding. On the other hand, if I thought that that God would give me a ticket every time I speed, and God is omnipresent, then I would never speed, because I know I'd get a ticket every single time. And so while using force to keep people in line can work, it's strange resources, because you just don't have enough. People will be obedient as long as they feel the physical threat of the police force. However, religion, on the other hand, makes people police themselves, because if you believe that these unseen gods are going to smack you down every time you do something wrong, well, you're going to keep doing right, because they're always there. There are these unseen spiritual forces who don't have the same locality as a human being who's in the military or the police. So, being a smart man, Constantine decided, let's come up with a religion that will unite the empire, and he likely found Christianity to be the most tolerable and least offensive faith to openly embrace, due to the piety and humility of its followers, and the fact that they were hardworking, that they were moral, that he didn't have to worry too much about them stabbing him in the back, literally or figuratively. That, again, the Christian faith tells you to be moral, to respect authority, to give to others, to be loving. All these things, Constantine probably thought, hey, this is a great religion. They won't threaten me, and they won't threaten my rule. They will be obedient, and they will be good, hardworking, pious people. So Christianity is the winner. And also helped that Christianity was growing so rapidly, and people were so effectively evangelizing. So that was Constantine. So eventually Constantine died, and he had a couple three successors, and they kind of went back and forth between going back to the old ways of persecuting Christians and making Christianity a criminal act again. And they went back and forth between that, and another one would bring some of Constantine's reforms back, then the one after that would make Christianity illegal again. Finally, his fourth successor was a emperor named Theodosius. And unlike Constantine, Theodosius was in all likelihood truly a Christian, and he did some radical things that his heart was in the right place, I think, but the execution was poor. He did what people give Constantine credit for doing. Theodosius made Christianity the official religion of Rome, number one. And number two, and this is bad actually, he outlawed all the other religions, which, so be it. But the bad thing he did was he forced everyone to become a Christian. He said if he made all other religions illegal and Christianity was the only legal religion, and you had to become a Christian by force. And this is bad because you can't force someone to become a Christian. Becoming a Christian is a choice to believe in the death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus as payment for your sins. You have to choose it. You can't be forced into it. So when Theodosius forced it, he did something that God never intended, and the results were catastrophic. Again, unlike the Christians who held on to their faith despite what the world would say, despite what the law said at the time, the pagans were not anywhere near that convicted in their beliefs. So they went to church. They were forced to go to church. They would go there, but they weren't Christian. So now the Christian leadership now had a problem. Your churches were now filled to the brim with unrepentant pagans who had no desire to be Christians, and no desire to hear the Christian doctrine or the Christian message. They were only there because they had no choice to be. They were there because they didn't want to go to jail, and they were causing a ruckus in the church. They were not being obedient. They were doing their pagan practices in the church. Things were to the point where they were about to tear themselves apart. The church was in serious trouble. But fortunately, or rather unfortunately, the Christians had some rescuers. There's a group of people who came to the rescue of the Christians to help them out. These people are called mystics. Now, if you have been following Faith by Reason for any length of time, you probably know who the mystics are. And you also know that they are some of my least favorite people to have ever lived. So for those of you who are new, let me explain to you what mystics are, or who mystics are. In a very general sense, mystics are groups who gain, grow, and maintain power through hoarding of knowledge and information that is either secret or very, very difficult to obtain. That's their only power. The power of a mystic is through hidden knowledge that they keep hidden. They don't let the general public have it, or they make it so difficult for the general public to have this information that it's virtually impossible for anyone outside of this group of mystics to know what they know, and they use this information as their power over other people. I will give you an example of a secular group of mystics, a common group of mystics. We call them attorneys or lawyers. Lawyers are mystics. Why? Because the only power an attorney has is that they know a certain amount of information, the law, better than you, and it's so difficult and expensive to learn the law that 99% of us don't bother doing it. We have other things to do. Lawyers don't materially contribute anything to society. They are materially worthless. They don't manufacture any goods or services. They don't create anything new. They don't create any technologies or apps. They don't build houses or practice medicine or do engineering or teach or do anything valuable. Their only reason for existence is that they have information that's difficult for the rest of us to have, and that's why they have money and power. Let me give you an example of how it works. Let's say you grow up and you're good with your hands. You're good working with wood and various tools, and you become good at being a handyman or whatnot, doing odd jobs, and people hire you more and more, and your business grows, and you hire some more people on, and you become a general contractor. You become a successful contractor. What do you have to do? What people tell you need to do? Well, they'll tell you need to get a lawyer. Why? Is that lawyer going to help you build houses or repair plumbing or lay new foundations or do any of that stuff? Nope. A lawyer is only there for one reason. When they say, why do you need a lawyer? in case somebody else sues you. Because if someone else sues you for whatever reason, they will also have a lawyer. And if you don't have a lawyer yourself, they'll eat you alive because they'll know the law better than you. So you have to have a lawyer basically to protect you from other lawyers. That's the only reason that lawyers exist, is to protect you from other lawyers. So if there were no lawyers, we would need that protection, and we'd still have every manufactured good and service that we have today. So lawyers only exist because other lawyers exist. It's like the old protection racket that you maybe see or read about in old mafia stories, where you have, a mom and pop store, they're just selling their goods on the corner store, and a couple of big burly thugs will walk in and say, hey, you guys need to start paying us $500 a week in protection money. And I say, why should we do that? What if we don't want to pay you? What's going to happen then? Well, if you don't pay us the protection money, we're going to come in here next week and wreck your store and beat you up. So you're paying them protection money to protect you from them. And that's what lawyers are. Lawyers have a protection racket. You have to hire a lawyer. Why? Well, because if you don't hire a lawyer, another lawyer is going to sue you, and you're going to get beat up. So you need to hire us to protect you from other lawyers. We're not going to actually contribute to your business in any measurable way, except it's part of this protection racket. So as you can tell, I don't have a terribly high opinion of lawyers and the way law is practiced these days. But anyway, that's an example I think we can all understand. But we want to focus on religious mystics. These are people who have hoard information that they claim is from a higher power or from the quote-unquote gods. Where did these people get their start? Well, it all started thousands of years ago, back in the early chapters of Genesis, the Babel incident. I think we all know about the Tower of Babel. We've seen the pictures. We've heard the stories in our Sunday school about the tower they built to reach the heavens and what God did. Well, the person who built who began building Babel and who started the entire ancient Babylonian empire was a man named Nimrod. Nimrod was the first world dictator, the first world leader, and he had a wife who may have also been his mother, which is pretty disgusting. Her name was Semiramis. She was his queen, and again, possibly his mother. Ew. But among other things, Semiramis led the worship of Nimrod as a god, namely the sun god. As the first world dictator, Semiramis, his wife, claimed that Nimrod, was the sun god. So, as Nimrod was the first secular world leader, Semiramis was the world's first creator and leader of organized religion. And of course, she had priests who helped her. These priests were her eyes and ears and ground soldiers who would spread the religious message of Nimrod's deity throughout the empire. And they were the ones who enforced the worship of Nimrod. Now, eventually Nimrod died, and there's some reason to believe that Semiramis may have been behind his death in order to gain more power. But shortly after he died, not too long after he died, Semiramis became pregnant, which means that during a period where she should have been mourning, our erstwhile queen kind of got busy with another person, which would be punishable by death. If people saw that during a time of mourning she was actually having intercourse with another guy, well, again, she'd be killed for treason. However, Semiramis was a clever lady. Well, she used the gospel story to her advantage. Now you may ask, wait a minute, how could she use the gospel story? During the time of Genesis, the gospel hadn't been written. The entire Bible hadn't been written. That's where you're incorrect. No, the Bible hadn't physically been written. However, the first documentation of the gospel was not in the Bible. It was actually a mnemonic that God wrote in the very stars themselves. In fact, I did a couple of, actually I think 3 or 4 podcasts and blogs about the gospel message that's in the stars. And I didn't just make this up. There's actually lots of Bible teachers who can show you this. You can look it up. You can Google it yourself, or better yet, go to faithbyreason.net in the area shown here, and you can read more about it. But God put his message in the stars. And back in Genesis chapters 1 and 2, it says that the stars were created for signs and for symbols, so the message of God is in the stars. I'm not talking about astrology. Astrology is where people use constellations in the stars to tell the future, and it's paganistic. No, these are the constellations that tell a story from Virgo, the Virgin, all the way through Leo, the Lion, the conquering king. It tells the entire. If you go through each one of these constellations, they go through a mnemonic of the entire story from the fall of man all the way to Jesus, the conquering king, coming back for a second coming. So that was already in the stars. So people knew God's plan before the Bible was even written. That's why when secular people say, well, there are religions that are older than the Bible. No, there's not. In order for a religion to be older than biblical Christianity, that religion would have to be older than the stars themselves. And I don't think even the most virulent secularists would contend that there is a religion that's older than the stars themselves. So anyway, Semiramis knew this, and she claimed that when Nimrod died, that she didn't cheat on him, that when Nimrod died, he ascended to the sun, and then one day the sun shone on her in a certain way, and she became impregnated by the spirit of Nimrod. And when Nimrod impregnated her, it was sort of an immaculate conception. They knew about the virgin birth. They knew that the seed of the woman would be the savior. And the seed of the woman is a inference to a virgin birth. So she claimed she had an immaculate conception from Nimrod, and that her child, who was named Tammuz, was not only a miraculous child, he was actually Nimrod resurrected. So Tammuz was not only the son of God, but he was God himself. And of course, she, being the vessel for God, she became the mother of God, the Holy Mother, the Blessed Woman. Some of you who are really smart are starting to see some connections here. But let's move on. So now you have this unholy trinity. You have Nimrod, the Father God. You have Semiramis, the Holy Mother. And you have Tammuz, the Son of God. It's basically Tammuz. She's making Tammuz into Jesus. And people bought it. They believed her, they worshipped her, and her mystics enforced it. So a little while after this, we had the event in Babel where the languages were confused, where God comes down to see the tower that they were building, and he confused the languages, and the people who spoke the same language, they got together and they dispersed throughout the earth, and they started the various nations. But the mystics, these priests, their language was confused as well, so they would end up going to whichever nation spoke the same language as them. But they also carried the false religion of Nimrod, Semiramis, and Tammuz with them. And eventually, of course, these nations would gain a leader. Some strong man, obviously usually a man, would gain a certain amount of power, and he would become the leader or the ruler, the king of this nation. Here's one thing you need to know that's very important about mystics. Mystics always go where the power is. Whenever the power is consolidated, you will find mystics there. Wherever there is a king, you will find mystics at his court. Why? Because mystics ingratiate themselves by helping the king with the knowledge that they have. They know that religion is a more effective way to rule the people than force, as I explained earlier. So mystics would teach the king, hey, Mr. King, make yourself into a god. We'll get the people to worship you, and we will get them to be obedient to you, not because you have a military force, which is a draining resource, but because you are a god and you will punish them supernaturally. And the kings liked that because it helped them be effective leaders, and the mystics liked it because it kept them in a powerful position at the king's court. And you will find this throughout history. If you look at the next major world empire was the Egyptian Empire, ruled by Pharaoh. We see that at the end of Genesis and in Exodus. Who was at Pharaoh's side? Mystics. We see them when Moses came to Pharaoh to free the children of Israel from bondage. Who did he encounter? The mystics. In fact, some of these mystics were able to, through some power that they gained demonically, to mimic the first two plagues that God sent on Egypt. Of course, they weren't able to do any more after that because they weren't as powerful. But the point is, everywhere there's power, there are mystics. So when Egypt was in power, the mystics were there. I think Paul named two of them, Janus and Jambres, in the New Testament. Paul named them in the New Testament. And then and of course, when they went to Egypt, they took a version of the religion of Nimrod, Semiramis, and Tammuz with them, and they renamed them to Egyptian names. Nimrod, Semiramis, and Tammuz became Osiris, Isis, and Horus. If you actually read the mythology around these Egyptian gods, it's eerily similar to exactly what happened with Nimrod and Semiramis and Tammuz. When the next world empire came around, which was the Assyrians, then the mystics moved to Assyria and they renamed their pantheon, and they took Nimrod, Semiramis, and Tammuz took on names like Dagon and Baal and Molech and Astarte and Ishtar. You saw this again through the Assyrians, and when the Babylonians took over, the mystics went to Babylon. We encounter them in the book of Daniel when Nebuchadnezzar had his dream and Nebuchadnezzar called his mystics in to interpret the dream, and they couldn't. Only Daniel could, because Daniel had was in touch with the true God. And then when the Greeks took over, when the Persians took over the Babylonian Empire, the second Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar, then the mystics went there, and you had the Persian gods again like Ishtar and Zoroaster. Then when the Greek Empire under Alexander took over from the Persians, the mystics went there, and they turned the three gods into Nimrod, Semiramis, and Tammuz suddenly became Zeus and Aphrodite and Dionysus. And then when Rome took over Greece, then the mystics went to Rome, and those same gods became Jupiter and Venus and Eros and Cupid. All those, they were always there. You will find throughout the world the same mother-child cults. You look at the screen, if you look at the depiction there, you will see how is it that almost every culture around the world has the same holy mother, holy child, holy father thing happening. Why? Because the mystics took that same ancient Babylonian religion and took it around the world. That's why in Revelation chapter 17 and 18, which we'll get to down the road a bit, Babylon is called the mother of harlots, harlotry being idolatry. This is the mother of, Semiramis is the mother of all religion. She is the great whore of Babylon, and the mystics are her spiritual children. So that brings us all the way back to where we were with the medieval church, the church that Theodosius started here, and the problem of all of these pagans being forced into Christianity, into the Christian church rather. And since the power was now with Christians, what would happen? Well, as you can guess, the mystics came to try to become Christians and ingratiate them with the Christian leadership by helping the Christians the way they try to help everyone in power, of course, to their own advantage. The mystics came to the Christian leadership and said, look, guys, we see your problem. We see that you have these hordes of pagans who don't want to obey you, who are fighting against you. Here's what you need to do. We know how to handle this. We've done it before. Because you see, basically, in each case, the mystics had their pattern of every time they go into a new culture and try to ingratiate themselves, they would absorb some of the native mythology and culture into their dogma, but they would always keep and promote some version of the king father Nimrod, the queen mother goddess Semiramis, and the divine offspring Tammuz, as we've just seen. And they instructed the Christians, hey, you guys can do the same thing. All you have to do is rename some of your Christian figures, give them names of some of the pagans. Or actually the inverse, take some of these pagan gods and rituals and give them Christian names. Blend the two together, so that it'll be more palatable to them and they'll have an easier time worshiping your Christian God. So the mystics advised the church leaders to simply adopt their operational method of assimilation. Again, nominally merging Christianity with paganism by clothing those pagan gods and practices in Christian trappings. The idea was that this would make the transition to Christianity easier for the pagans, and eventually, as the pagans became true converts and fully adopted Christianity, they could eliminate the pagan elements. You can get rid of all the pagan trappings, and it'll be 100% Christian. Thus, Nimrod, Semiramis, and Tammuz became the primary quote-unquote Christian pantheon of God the Father, the Virgin Mary, the Holy Mother, and Jesus, the Divine Son. They just basically slapped their names onto God, the Virgin Mary, who was never meant to be worshipped, by the way, and Jesus. And then all the various and sundry pagan gods of harvest, luck, strength, love, lightning, thunder, oceans, and whatever, they just renamed them saints, such as Peter, Paul, John, Thomas, and whoever else the mystics decided to throw in. And all the various pagan ceremonies and festivals were also Christianized. Don't believe me? Well, let's look at a couple of really, really popular pagan festivals that were Christianized. One such festival that exemplifies this merger is a celebration we call Christmas. Christmas is a Christianized version of a popular pagan holiday centered around the sun god, who was contemporarily at that time known as Sol Invictus, which again is basically Nimrod. The Sol Invictus was the sun god. And here's how it went. Here, first of all, if you're even a remotely sophisticated Christian, you know that Jesus was not born anywhere near December 25th. Absolutely not. Jesus was most likely, we've talked about this You can look up the series on Jesus where we talk about his nativity. He was most likely born in late summer. Why do we know this? Well, number one, it snows in Israel at that time. It's freezing. He would have frozen to death in a barn. Also, you had shepherds out in the field at night. It would be too cold for sheep to be out at night in late December. They would freeze to death as well. It was most likely the shepherds were out there because it was a time of year when the sheep are sheared for their wool, and they keep them outside because it's more convenient than marching them back and forth into the barn. And that happens in around late August, early September, which is probably around the time Jesus was born. So he was probably born in midsummer. It doesn't matter because we were never told to celebrate Jesus' birth. But anyway, why is December 25th celebrated? Because again, it's the sun god, the S-U-N, the son, S-U-N, of God. His birth is considered to be December 25th. Why? Because at the time of the so-called winter solstice, which is December 21st, the sun, S-U-N, is at its lowest point in the daytime sky. It would stay in that low level for 3 more days and then begin to rise gradually until it reached its highest point at the summer solstice, which when at the point the sun is highest in the sky, that's our summer. So the pagan tradition is that the Son of God, S-U-N, died on December 21st, stayed dead for 3 days, and then God's Son, S-U-N, was reborn on December 25th. So it's pretty easy to see how this was adopted by the church by replacing S-U-N with S-O-N, and the celebration became a Mass, or Mass for Christ, or a Christ Mass. You're starting to see what's going on here, aren't you? In fact, here let's talk about a few of those traditions. One of the popular traditions from this celebration was to take a large log called the Yule, Y-U-L-E, which is ancient Chaldean word for child, and burn this Yule log in a fireplace on December 21st. They would then let the ashes lay there for 3 days, and then on the 3rd day, replace the log with an evergreen tree decked with gold and silver to celebrate life. Yeah, that's right, folks. That's a Christmas tree. When you put your Christmas tree up last year, you were doing a pagan ritual. When you decked it with gold and silver trimmings and little globes and whatnot, you were actively participating in a pagan tradition while you were allegedly celebrating the birth of Jesus. Oh, and that's not just conjecture on my part. It's actually in the Bible. Yes, that's right, folks. The Christmas tree as a pagan symbol is in the Bible. Let's read from the book of Jeremiah, chapter 10, verses 1 through 5. And it says, "Thus saith the Lord, do not learn the way of the Gentiles. Do not be dismayed at the signs of heaven, for the Gentiles are dismayed at them." Signs in the heavens, what could that mean? "For the customs of the people are futile. For one cuts a tree from the forest, the work of the hands of the workmen with an axe. They decorate it with silver and gold. They fasten it with nails and hammers so that it will not topple. They are upright like a palm tree, and they cannot speak, and they must be carried, because they cannot go by themselves. Do not be afraid of them, for they cannot do evil, nor can they do any good." Folks, that's the description of a Christmas tree. If you read everything in context, God is talking about the Christmas tree, this tree decked in gold and silver as a symbol for paganism, and he tells us not to do it, yet we do it anyway. Why? Because we've compromised with the world. What would the world think if we didn't celebrate Christmas with them? What if we said, hey, you know what, I'm not going to celebrate this because I'm a Christian and this is not the birth of Jesus, and all these things are paganistic, which they are, by the way. All the things have to do with Christmas. Holly is paganistic. Druids use holly for casting spells. Mistletoe is paganistic. Wreaths are paganistic. All this stuff is pagan. If you tell someone you're not going to do that, they're going to think, well, wow, what kind of religious fanatic are you? You're just kind of weirdo. You're going to deny your kids the happiest time of the year for presents and all this stuff just because of your silly Christian traditions, or because of your Christian religious intolerance. Well, no, I guess I don't want to do that. I don't want to be seen as weird, so I guess I'll just keep doing all these pagan practices on the supposed birthday of Jesus, even though it's not his birthday, and even though these are all pagan traditions and I'm supposed to be a Christian. I'll do them anyway because I don't want to be rejected. Yeah, that's called compromise. Compromising with the world for your comfort. Oh, but it gets worse. See, at least with Christmas, they actually tried to throw the name Christ in there to make it a little more palatable. The other celebration, which is frankly a day that we're supposed to, that God does want us to celebrate an act that Jesus did, and that will be his resurrection. That holiday, they don't even bother changing the name. Easter, which we celebrate when we celebrate the resurrection of Christ, Easter is a pagan name in and of itself. It's actually the name of Ishtar, who is basically the Persian version of Semiramis. Ishtar is slightly transliterated into the English as Easter. Easter, Ishtar are the same thing. Ishtar, who is again another name for Semiramis, was the goddess of fertility. That's why you have those fertility symbols like rabbits and eggs during Resurrection Day. So when you call the Resurrection Day of Christ the most holy day in all Christianity, when you call that Ishtar, you are basically slapping the name of the mother of harlots onto the most holy and sacred day in all of Christianity. When you have your kids hunting Easter eggs and chasing rabbits around and doing all these spring fertility festivals, you are basically taking paganism and slapping it onto what's supposed to be the most holy day of the year. That is how deep the corruption has gone and how that corruption still persists to this day. So let's go back to the 4th century. Why would the church leaders voluntarily go along with such a blatant corruption of their faith? Why would they allow the pagans to compromise Christianity? Why? It's very simple. Because the Christian leaders have become comfortable with their new position. The church leaders enjoyed not being persecuted. I mean, who wouldn't? But more pertinently, the Christian leaders began to love and covet their newly gained power as power brokers in the Roman Empire, and they were willing to compromise themselves to avoid losing it. They were willing to go along with the plan of the mystics because they thought, well, it doesn't sound right. It was slapping the name of God and Jesus and Mary onto these pagan symbols. But if it keeps everything settled, if it keeps all the pagans quiet and keeps our money and power flowing in, well, I guess we'll do it. You see, the reason that the church grew and flourished during the persecutions is because they were forced by circumstance to rely completely on God for their day-to-day survival and sustenance. They didn't cling to their earthly lives because there was nothing appealing about their earthly lives. So they focused on God and on the true meaning of life, which I talk about very early on in the podcasts and blogs. However, as these newly freed and prominent Christians gained their status in the empire, they no longer needed God's constant protection and provision. They got that from the empire. So their earthly lives became pleasurable. See, man's nature and tendency towards comparative thinking eventually led the church away from God and into the waiting arms of the mystics. The mystics enthralled the church leaders into playing a game in which the church was thoroughly outmatched. Over the centuries, as I've said, the mystics have perfected the art and strategy of conquest through infiltration. The church leaders didn't stand a chance. There is no compromise with evil that can result in good. You cannot compromise evil with good. Evil will always win. When you mix water and poison, water will not win. Poison will always win. You will not get slightly dirty water. You will get poison that just kills you a little more slowly, but it will still kill you. You mix water and poison, poison wins. You mix good and evil, evil wins. There is no compromise with evil that can benefit in the long-term good. The mystics knew this. The Christians didn't. The mystics knew that once introduced, that corruption that they introduced into Christianity would not be eliminated. They knew that it wouldn't be phased out. They knew it was just the opposite would happen, that corruption would fester and grow until it affected the very fabric of the church doctrine and became entrenched in church tradition. That's why 1,500 years after this plan was enacted, you're still putting up Christmas trees. You're still celebrating Easter and calling the resurrection of Jesus Easter Day. The person who is in front of your church is still wearing a robe. There's still stained glass. There's still mistletoe and holly all over the place. There are still all of these ritualistic, paganistic things that God hates in every single church. I will give you one more example from the scripture in the letter to the church at Pergamos. It says that in verse 15, thus you have those who hold the doctrine of the Nicolaitans, which thing I hate. What is the doctrine of the Nicolaitans? We talked about this in the letter to the church at Ephesus. The Nicolaitans are those who wanted to rule over the church. Nikeo means to rule over. Laitans, or laity, means the people. These were people who claimed that they spoke for God. They claimed to be church leaders. They claimed to be what we currently call pastors and preachers, people who put themselves in a position of being the mediator between God and man. Jesus hates that because Jesus is the mediator between God and man. Jesus is the head of the church, not somebody wearing a bunch of robes and claiming that they have some kind of special relationship with God, and that God will give them a special message on Saturday night and they'll come and preach it Sunday morning so that they can tell you what God really says, and you don't have to worry about reading about it yourself. You can just sit there in the pews, absorb the message from this Nicolaitan, and whatever they say goes. There are people to this day who worship their pastor to this, almost to the same degree as they worship their God. Our God, the God of the Bible. I grew up in such a church. I grew up with where my family, we revered the preacher. The preacher could do no wrong. You could never say anything bad about Reverend so-and-so or the good Reverend Dr. whoever. They elevate this human being to a high position on par with God. Oh, he's the man of God. And since he's the man of God, he can do no wrong. He's touched not mine anointed and do my prophets no harm, so forth and so on. That is a Nicolaitan. The Ephesian church did right in rejecting it. The compromising church at Pergamos did not. They did the opposite. They embraced it. And Jesus said he hates that. So, as is their method, once the mystics gained a foothold in the church, they began to dominate it. They slowly, gradually forced the true Christians out. And the pagan mystics of Rome became the priests, bishops, cardinals, and popes of the church. They became Pontifex Maximus. Priests and bishops and cardinals. These are all mystics. Mystics go wherever the power is and they take over, and that's what they did in the church. I mean, sure, they replaced some of their pagan symbols with crosses and nominally invoked the name of Jesus in their rituals and put halos and angels' wings on their idols, but for all intents and purposes, they essentially continued and still do continue practicing the mysticism of ancient Babel, Nimrod, Semiramis, and Tammuz, as they have done since the days of Genesis chapter 10 and 11 with Babel. In case it has not become clear, the religion I'm referring to, this mixture of paganism and Christianity, is what we know today as Roman Catholicism. Catholicism is the blend of Christian doctrine and pagan practices that began with Constantine and endures to this day. The religion of Catholicism pretty much epitomizes everything I've written about religion and mystics on Faith by Reason. And I'm sorry if that's controversial, but it's the truth. It's documented. The history of Constantine is documented. The history of Theodosius is documented. Saturnalia, Sol Invictus, Easter, Ishtar, all that is documented and easily researched by anyone. And if you don't like it, I'm sorry, you just need to take your religious blinders off and face the fact that Catholicism is a pagan practice and is led by mystics to this day. And we're going to talk a whole lot more about that in the next episode. So if this episode bugged you, well, you're going to really hate the next one, because we're going to go into deep detail on how these pagan mystics clothed themselves in Christian garments and ruled the world for 1,000 years and rule a great deal of it to this day. And it is all the fault of the church, because the church compromised. If the church had stayed strong and not compromised, this would not have happened. But because it compromised, we endured over 1,000 years of theocratic rule, of people doing brutally horrible pagan things in the name of Jesus. And it has had a devastating effect on Christianity. And again, we'll talk about it a lot more in the next episode. So let's wrap things up by looking at Jesus' final proclamations to the church of Pergamos. So verse 16, repent, or else I will come to you quickly and fight against them with the sword of my mouth. And what is that sword? Is the two-edged sword is the Bible. Jesus will use the word of God to as a sword to separate those who are still holy from those that are unholy. Jesus is going to break up this mixed marriage, this unholy union between the church and the world, and it will be painful. Verse 17, he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. That Jesus uses this to close out all of his letters. To him who overcomes, I will give to eat some of the hidden manna to eat. And what does that mean? Well, manna is the food that God gave the Israelites during the wilderness wandering. It's also called angel's food. It's hidden. I think this is a play on. It's a pun. It's a play on words. It's a play on terms, because the mystics were people who had hidden information that they used to rule over people. Hidden manna is life. Manna sustained people. Jesus says that you mystics are using your hidden knowledge to rule over the people. Well, he who overcomes your nonsense, I will give him hidden food that will give him life to sustain him. To keep going, and I will give him a white stone, and on that stone a new name written, which no one knows except him who receives it. There are many interpretations of what this white stone is. One of the ones that I gravitate towards is the fact that when they had democratic elections during this time in the ancient world, you would be given a white stone or a red stone. A white stone was a yes vote, and a black stone was a no vote. So if you liked whatever was being voted upon, you put your white stone in. If you wanted to reject it, you put your black stone in. So I believe that when they talk about the white stone, Jesus is saying he will, if you overcome, he will vote for you, and it will be a personal vote, a personal endorsement in your favor, because it will have your new name written on it that nobody knows except you. So Jesus is going to vote for you individually and vote in favor of you in a very, very personal way, because your name will be written on that white stone. All right, well, that wraps up the section on the church at Pergamos, the medieval church. And again, you cannot compromise. You cannot compromise as a church. You cannot compromise personally, because evil will always win whenever you compromise with it. And it leads to devastation, which we will talk about that devastation in the next episode. So, sorry, this went way over. I mean, I think I went double time. This is twice as long as I intended, but I think this is really vital information. The next one hopefully will be a little bit shorter than this one when we get to Thyatira. And in Thyatira, again, we'll be talking about the Roman Church. So thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. I appreciate it. Please do that thing we like you do on YouTube, where you like and subscribe and share and hit notifications and do all that good stuff. You can subscribe to Faith by Reason directly by just putting your email into the right navigation area, and you will get these episodes as soon as they are available. And I will talk to you next week when we go to church number 4, the church at Thyatira, the Roman church. Now, one last word for all of you who are Catholic or are nominally Catholic or upset about this. I will give you one note of solace. If Thyatira represents the Catholic Church and things are pretty bad there, then the next church, historically speaking, would have to represent the Protestant church, wouldn't it? Well, here's the problem. That next church that represents the Protestant church, the church at Sardis, is one of 2 churches about which Jesus has nothing positive to say. He has some positive things to say about the church at Thyatira, but nothing positive to say at Sardis. So if Sardis represents the Protestant church in their own way, they're in worse shape than the Catholic church. All right, folks, that wraps it up. I will talk to you next week.